Hello, everybody. I'm a practicing therapist and a doctoral student of psychology. Today, we're going to talk about how men and women perceive the opposite gender for long-term relationships based on their perception of introversion versus extroversion. And so today, we're actually going to talk about, do men prefer introverted or extroverted women? And the research is in the description box, and we're going to break up the research throughout the video. But even before we jump into that, I just want to go ahead and summarize my findings based on the research, or the findings is a better way to put it. For long-term relationships, men actually, based on research, prefer mildly to moderately introverted women based on their perspective, which we will talk about. But for short-term, it actually seems that the research suggests men leans slightly more towards extroverted women. So what does that mean? Let's talk about that. So that's the summary. But why not we break it down based on the research in more detail? What is the perception and why do men prefer these from a biological standpoint, from a social psychology standpoint, as well as an evolutionary psychology standpoint? So introverted women, what is this based on the research and why do men prefer this? Research suggests, and this research was done in 2011, suggests that men often value and prefer moderate or mild introversion in women for long-term relationships. So, and if I'm looking down, it's because I'm looking at the summary that I wrote for the research I read, because there's a lot of research and I'm always summarizing because I will forget and I want to be accurate. And so that's why I'm looking at my laptop. And so the traits that I found in the research that was based on this one in 2011, among other ones, including one in 2007, traits like thoughtfulness, emotional stability, intelligence, and nurturing tendencies are often associated with introversion based on how men perceive women, but also we saw that to some extent psychologically, which men find highly attractive. Now, of course, this is just personality. We're not talking about physical characteristics because physical characteristics play a fundamental role in attraction. We're just talking about the personality differences, introversion versus extroversion. And the study that we were talking about earlier, the 2011 study, shows that men often prefer women who they perceive has a combination of warmth and intelligence, which is kind of what we already talked about, that thoughtfulness. I think intelligence is more about just being more comfortable learning knowledge. I don't think it has to mean that you have to be a genius necessarily, because I don't think men care about things like that nearly as much. But from the research, I think it's more about being able to communicate in an emotionally stable way, which men associate with intelligence. So that's how I took it. And they prefer this over direct social ability or the concept of just always wanting to be the center of attention or communicating continuously with many people. A lot of men would prefer ladies not being necessarily like that. That doesn't mean it's wrong or right. It just, that's the research. And everybody's different too. There's no judgment on either side from my perspective. So what is extroverted women based on the research? 2007 and 2011 is the ones that we're talking about specifically for this point. Extroversion is still valued, but it is far more for social and short-term contexts, at least particularly for men. Now, highly extroverted women can signal what men have described in this dynamic as relaxing, fun, adventurous, but it does show that extreme extroversion actually can be less compatible for daily life or long-term stability, which can actually be unattractive to some men. Now, the research in 2007 shows that moderate extroversion can be attractive. However, men prioritize emotional support, reliability, and thoughtfulness over both introversion and extroversion. However, they tend to perceive introversion to have those traits already, which is why they prioritize that over extroverted traits. It may not be, though, but it's just based on this finding. I wanted to also talk about the summary of these findings based on how this is perceived for attractiveness, social dominance, etc., and how this relates to long-term stability. So that's more of a clinical standpoint, okay? So a man's long-term preference emphasizes stability much more over social dominance. So he doesn't, of course, this is a little different for ladies, right? But for men, they don't really care, to be honest, based on the research, how compatible you are with different spaces socially or how much of a leader you are. Men do not really care about things like that. Does he want you to have friends? Probably. Does he not want you to be lonely and have, people you can hang out with or call your girlfriends up for certain things? I'm sure he does. But it's not a main criteria. He will only want her based on this. Emotional stability and how she behaves is much more important. And so only will he really worry about her social situation, at least from this standpoint, if maybe it seems that she's becoming unstable due to lack of social situations. And so emotional stability is very important. And so what do men, based on this research, perceive as stable? So often it will be being able to take accountability, being able to be kind, respectful, intelligent to some extent. So having some communication that's able to be, it's not always one-sided. So he can have input and you can have input. It's going to be both, right? And a lot of times emotional warmth. So just how he feels not judged by this particular lady. So the research does show that another portion of introversion that might be perceived attractive for long-term relationships, this is just what's in the research. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. It also does show that introverted women can be perceived, some of them highly preferred, for commitment because it's perceived loyalty, emotional depth, and compatibility. That is interesting. I didn't really put those two together until I read this, but that makes sense. I think that makes sense. I think the loyalty portion was an interesting piece, but it is there. And there is some research that does show that people do prefer based on how they are. So I'm going to explain that more. Introverted men often prefer introverted women. Not always the case, but it is true. And then extroverted men may enjoy moderate extroversion or moderate to mild introversion. And so long-term preferences, regardless, do still tend to heavily weigh emotional stability rather than just social dominance or expectations. And what we see is both extreme introversion and extreme extroversion is actually less favored, particularly for men. So let's say someone who is extremely shy or someone who's extremely outgoing. These tend to be a little bit less attractive overall, the average, the mean for long-term relationships. That doesn't mean that there aren't some men who prefer extroverted women. There absolutely are. I'm just saying the average. That's all these videos typically are. I'm just saying the average. I'm not saying every single man is the same. And so what does that mean and what can we do with this information? So all that this is for informational purposes, but if there is any ladies out there who feels like they have to be sociable to attract men, you don't. And you can be yourself. Now, if you are somebody who's extroverted, that's okay too. And what you can do is you can take some of these aspects that men perceive to be attractive, such as loyal, such as emotional depth, such as warmth, such as kindness, and you can add that to yourself, which is all that men are typically looking for, at least from this space in this particular example. Most men, that's really what they're looking for underneath some of these things. And so if you can add those things to your personality, or if you're suppressing those things, you can learn to manage those things to be more outward in your personality. That can really benefit you to be more connected to other men. Sorry, to men, not other men. And so men do prefer introverted ladies typically, and extroversion does help in social contexts, but it's not the trait that men are typically looking for. Men don't see it like that based on this research. Research is in the description box. I hope this video is helpful to somebody. Please like, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.